Hello and welcome to our today's event of an interview and discussion with none other than MJ Akbar Sahab, India's former Minister of State for External Affairs and a veteran journalist and one of the finest authority on foreign policy, British Indian history, Islamism in South Asia, and a diverse range of topics. Before I begin, I would like to give the brief bio of MJ Akbar Sahab. And I'm Abhinav, your moderator for today's session. So now I'll begin with the bio of MJ Akbar Sahab. MJ Akbar Sahab has served as the Minister of State for External Affairs. In the year 1971, he joined Times of India and then the Illustrated Weekly of India. He was appointed the editor of Sunday in 1976 and soon turned it into India's largest political news weekly. In the year 1982, he launched Telegraph. Simultaneously, he authored a series of books on the history of South Asia and the complex interweaving between religious doctrine, the politicization of faith in India. Some of the books include India, the Siege Within, which came in the year 1985, and his authoritative book on Nehru, which still continues to be the most authoritative account of Nehru's life. That's Nehru, The Making of India in the year 1989. The Shade of Words, Jihad and Conflict Between Islam and Christianity, and the foundations of our understanding of Pakistan for most of the young generation of strategic scholars of South Asia, the Tinderbox Past and Future of Pakistan. And the most recent of his books include Gandhi's Hinduism, The Struggle Against Jinnah's Islam, which came in the year 2020, and Dulali Sahab, Racism and Revenge in British Raj in the year 2022. So today's session is going to be slightly different in the format as compared to our previous sessions. This is an interview come discussion. So first of all, I would like to request all the guests to welcome our eminent guest today, Shri MJ Akbar Sahab, and then I'll begin with the question and answer session. Sir, good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, sir. So, sir, we have, as young scholars of international relations and history, we have grown up reading your articles, your books, and they literally helped us in a major way in developing our understanding of South Asia in various domains, be it international relations, history, or political science. Recently, I was going through some of your writings, which came in Open the Magazine, and also some of the reviews of your books. So I'll begin with a topic which is most critical and most relevant to today's time, the New World Order. In one of your articles for the Open magazine, you wrote that experience has taught Germany and Japan that fascism is suicidal and domination is dead. The 21st century must see a shared world inching as best as it can, and perhaps only where it can, towards the liberal democratic horizon. India will become a significant part of the new architecture for stability, for it is a democratic state with a liberal constitution and a proven ability to defend its borders and preserve its values. So my question basically comes from this. So will it be a multipolar world? And if it's a multipolar world, will it be anarchic and chaotic or a stable? How do you look at India's stand in this, in India's role in this emerging new world order?
Nobody's going to actively search for chaos, I hope.
Hello.
But what we are seeing at this moment, let me begin with the immediate context. The very first 2 decades of the 21st century have upended and changed dramatically the world order as defined by the victors of World War II, which has been in real existence for the last 7 decades and more. It was essentially a bipolar world. Normatively, we think of 5 victors of World War II, but in real terms, there were only 2 victors of World War II. One was America and that part of the globe which it led, and the other was the Soviet Union and that part of the globe which it led. Let me step aside and ask a very interesting, what I think is interesting question. when does a century begin? A century never begins with a calendar. A century begins with a defining event. The 20th century began with 1914 because the First World War actually had an impact not only on the rest of the century, but in fact beyond the 20th century. So it's very in political terms, it is makes more sense to say that the 20th century began in 1914. The 21st century has had two beginnings. One, 9/11, which led to significant intervention in world affairs by by America, which was the target of 9/11. And second beginning, I think, is the beginning that we are seeing with the Russian intervention into Ukraine. Now, why? The United States, from about 10 years before 9/11, and the fall of communism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, had taken it upon itself to become the guardian, the philosopher, the lead merchant, the media manager, the technology czar, the guru, and the wealth manager of the world. It had become, in many senses, unilateral rather than a bipolar world. We've always all heard the famous phrase military-industrial complex, but to which I must add that the power of the United States was actually expressed in a military-industrial academic complex. And academia played a very important role in the shaping of ideas. Of course, we are familiar with the end of history thesis, but the end of history thesis really meant that the 21st century was going to become Pax Americana, that America, the power behind the 20th century, would actually also control the 21st century. Very unusual. And we quickly learned in the first decade of the 21st century that it was an impossible dream. Because after America's intervention in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, you could see the unraveling of American power visibly, very quickly, right in front of you. America got trapped in Baghdad, which it never truly emerged from. And we saw what happened in Kabul. In fact, in the same piece, I began by saying that we could see the sunset of the American empire, American Pax Americana in Kabul, the twilight in Ukraine, and if America was not careful, we could perhaps see its deepening it into the darkness over the Pacific. Now, the American inability was very evident by about 2011, 2012, when the Arab Spring came up. And America, instead of intervening to be able to protect its interests, left space vacant. And this space was taken by Russia. And in fact, in the second decade of the 20th century, we could see Russia under President Vladimir Putin expanding its space in very well-measured steps, very successfully. By the middle of the decade, America had actually moved into Ukraine, taken Crimea, and all the while, the only response that Moscow could hear from Washington was silence, acceptance. Even now, in the present conflict in Ukraine, President Zelensky began, I think, in the early days, saying by saying that he felt abandoned by. But America had never really abandoned Ukraine in February. America abandoned Ukraine in the first week of December, when President Biden said that America would not act militarily in case of any intervention. I mean, that was the moment when anyone listening in Moscow realized that America was never going to be a successful guardian of its allies. But yeah, Moscow made its own mistake. What has been Russia's ambitions, Russia's strategic objectives, in addition, of course, to recreating its space in the Middle East or West Asia, which it did successfully. And that was the reinvention of the Soviet Union in another format, you may say, in another dispensation, you might say, but essentially to recreate the zone of influence which it had exercised after the end of the Second World War. This turned out to be unsustainable. Just as America's ambitions were impossible, this turned out to be unsustainable. Why was it unsustainable? It was unsustainable because the world has entered a different era in gradual steps. Nothing happens suddenly, nothing happens in one dramatic sweep. In slow steps, it has entered what I have described as the age of the nation state, which is the age of independence. This is the era of independence, not of the age of empires began to collapse visibly at the end of First World War. By the end of Second World War, the last vestige of empire, which was imperialism, began to crumble. Interestingly, imperialism or colonialism ended where it had began in India, because after British defeat and the success of our independence movement, colonialism could not survive anywhere else. The empire, which had survived for 200 years, collapsed in another 25 years. But this age of the nation state is really going to be the major consequence. The present conflict in Ukraine will be resolved in some way or the other. But the important thing is not how this is resolved, but the consequences. The consequences mean that there is not going to be another Ukraine. That much is very, very clear and should be made clear to everybody. It's not just the present, it's not just Moscow which should see it. This should be seen as keenly by Beijing, by other capitals which may have ambitions towards reimagining what their nations will be. Now, we are already, even though the conflict has not ended, we are already seeing very significant signs of very dramatic change. The most important was the statement, in my view, by Prime Minister or former Prime Minister Abe of Japan, who in the second week of the start of war in Ukraine gave a television interview to a Japanese station in which he said very clearly, no one should miss what he said. He said, Japan wanted nuclear weapons on its soil. That means Japan wants its fingers very close to the nuclear trigger. Leave aside anything else. For me, this means the end of NPT. And because if Japan is going to abandon the NPT, then the whole idea now has outlived its utility. If that, simultaneously with that, what are we seeing? We are seeing already announced, perhaps not registered anywhere except in the shares of defense industries. Germany has announced that it has doubled its military budget. So the remilitarization of Germany, the potential, if not actual, nuclearization of Japan means that the era of the victors, Germany and Japan were the two countries which had been vanquished in the Second World War, which means that Germany and Japan are going to, over the next 10 years, demand their legitimate space in the New World Order. Those of you who are familiar with the corners of the United Nations will know that there is something called G4. It's a group of four which holds its meetings very quickly each year. And it has been actually asking for a reform in the Security Council, which means a change in the patterns of power at the United Nations. Germany, Japan, India are three. And I think Germany, Japan, and India are going to play a significant role in the emergence of the New World Order. This new world order is going to have the nation state as the building block of the international architecture of security. And nation state means borders whose integrity is guaranteed by this new order. But it also means that nation states have to be built on what might be called modern principles. What are modern principles? Democracy is certainly one of them. Freedom of speech and freedom of faith, equality of faith are essential to any construct of which democracy is a fundamental principle. Economic equity. The New World Order will make no sense if it does not make its primary objective the elimination, not alleviation, of poverty, gender empowerment, and ideas which are modern ideas. They will be the cornerstones of the New World Order. This is a process which, even as we speak, I think has begun. And there is a huge earthquake has taken place across all the thinking capitals of the world. And I think diplomacy in the next 10, 15 years for all governments is going to be a very important challenge as we look for ways and means by which we can now create this order without conflict. Because if there is going to be more conflict, then what you said in the beginning might understandably be the heavy price that we have to pay. But one of the principles of this new world order has to be that conflict is not the means to conflict resolution. Conflict is not the means to conflict resolution. This is something that has to be non-negotiable, because forget the case of 5 or 6 or 7 nuclear powers. In the next 10 years, you're going to see far more many powers which are effectively nuclear. And therefore, even as we search for more stability, inherently, the world will simultaneously become a more dangerous place. And it is the search for sanity within an existential danger, which is going to be the great challenge ahead of the next generation, which will be tasked with looking after. I was going to use a term world peace, and then I got frightened of it, because is that phrase a bit too ambitious to use? Well, let's just say world stability, global stability.
Thank you. So just one related aspect of the stuff which you discussed, we would like to know your thoughts on India's stand in the current Ukraine-Russian war. We've been facing a lot of pressure from the Western governments and the mainstream media. So what's your take on this?
Look, pressure is not something that is applied. Pressure is measured by the person upon whom it is being applied. If India doesn't feel the pressure, who is anyone else to apply pressure? And why should India feel pressure? India is an independent nation. India is a powerful nation. India knows the meaning of its handling its own security and furthering its own interests. We have certain equations. We are not going to fall into the trap of knee-jerk reactions. I think our government has upheld a very important, long-standing tradition of non-intervention, of taking a balanced view. I often say that one of the significant changes that has to happen for maybe 300 years, 400 years, the theory called the balance of power has been one of the operational doctrines of world diplomacy. It's something which emerged in Europe and was inflicted gradually upon the rest of the world. But basically, balance of power is the ability of defense sectors to sell arms to both sides. This has to be replaced with what I believe and trust is a motivational principle of Indian diplomacy, which is the power of balance. And it is the power of balance which India is applying. And that is why today you can see how effective it is. Because even as we speak, in the last 7 days, 8 days, 10 days, the world is coming to Delhi rather than Delhi going to the world. Because India is a very important voice under Prime Minister Modi. His own stature, of course, plays a significant part in the situation today. But equally, it is the principles upon which we have founded a foreign policy that the world is recognizing, because we need people who can speak to all sides without becoming a player in a dangerous, deadly, septic international casino.
Thank you. So now we have a few questions on a topic on which, like, you have written profusely over the last 20 years. So this is about political Islam. Can you make a distinction between political Islam and Islamist extremism in the broader context of Islam as a religion?
Well, political religion by itself should not exist, because religion is a personal matter. Faith is a personal matter. Faith is worshipped in a mosque, in a church, in a temple. Faith is not worshipped in a municipality. Faith is not worshipped in an assembly house. Faith is not worshipped in a parliament. So there should be nothing called political Islam or political Christianity or political Hinduism or political Buddhism or political anything, right? Extremism is very well recognized. Extremism is the use of barbaric violence, particularly in its manifestation in terrorism, in order to pursue a political cause. And that war, as I have said, whether it is the war of terrorism or it is the war of, battalions, it is not going to be the way and means forward. I think enough sense now prevails among the rational part of the globe to believe that, terrorism is absolutely unacceptable. I think there is consensus about this across all over the world, even though there are countries which continue to encourage surreptitious terrorism. But I think, most nations genuinely believe that the terrorism is not only dangerous for the enemy, terrorism is even more corrosive and dangerous for its perpetrators. It destroys he who uses it.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So another question in the same line. So why Islam has not been a cohesive force in building a regional identity in West Asia?
Why, again, you are confusing Islam with nationalism. I have said it is the age of the nation state, not the age of the religious state. So why should a religion be a cohesive factor in the dealings between nations? Today, as we speak, one of the visitors to Delhi is the Prime Minister of Nepal. Nepal is a country of 95%, maybe more Hindus. India is a country with 80% Hindus. It doesn't make us, it doesn't make our national interests the same. And why should they be the same? So why should Islam, operate as a unifying force in West Asia? After all, if religion had been sufficient as a basis of nationalism, why would there be over 50 countries in OIC, which is the Organization of Islamic, now called Cooperation, but Islamic countries? These are all 19th century ideas, and the sooner or before that, And the sooner we get rid of them and create a modern states, the better it is for all concerned.
Thank you, sir. Thank you
One
so
of the
much
good
for.
things, really, of the old communist states, is that they never allowed religion into the political sphere. Of course, they went overboard and didn't allow religion into the personal sphere also. But
So actually, I was going through one of your review of one of the books, Iftikhar Ahmad. The article was titled as "How Jinnah Divided Muslims." So in that, you're writing that Jinnah was never privately sure about what Pakistan would mean in real terms, which is why he never defined the geography or ideology of his imagined country, the two essential parameters of a nation state. Jinnah's inflexible argument that Muslims could not live with Hindus in one nation had no basis in either the history or the geography of the subcontinent. So now, with this, given this argument, given what you have written, I have a question which may sound a little hypothetical or even like falling in the domain of fiction. I mean, I would say that even prior to when Jinnah started this partition movement, India was facing communal riots and communal situations right from 1920 after the Khilafat movement, when like or even before that maybe. After independence also, we have had a spate of communal riots across the country. So if we ask a counter question, I mean, I'm asking this because we always ask a question that, who was responsible for partition? Could it be avoided? What could we have done? But there's a different question. What could have been the scenario if partition had not taken place?
first, you have raised questions which I think are best answered by a full reading of my book. I really would urge you, if you don't mind my saying so, to read the book rather than a review. Yes, that quotation is from my book, and the book actually explains why riots, the partition did not come because of riots. Riots came because of the idea of partition, right? And of course, there will be civil violence in any society, not in India, but in its instance of civil violence, don't have to be extrapolated into the creation of new countries. Otherwise, you'd be having new countries every week all across the world. So, I think the latter part of your question was, the last part of your question was?
What could have been the scenario if partition had not taken place?
Well, that's quite easily answered, because it is the experience of partition which created the bitterness that has still not left, the venom that has still not left the bloodstream or the subcontinent. Without the venom, now let me give a case of Punjab itself. Before, under British rule, and the British used, exploited divisive religion, divided religion in order to rule. We all know that. That's very familiar. So even under British rule, Punjab, which is then now, they became the fulcrum of West Pakistan, uh, was ruled, governed by an alliance by a Unionist party. Now, Unionist party was exactly what it said on the tin, on the label, which is that it is a union of Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. All three were represented, and they provided the best governance in India up to 47. The best government in India, over and over again in the transfer of power papers, even British viceroys keep saying over and over again. I said, we can't understand what this means because in Punjab, the unionist government has provided the best governance. So if it could have been provided before partition, why could it not be the same situation after partition?
Hello. Thank you. Thank you. So one more question related to your book only. So that's what on Gandhi's Hinduism and Jinnah's Islam. So I have a slightly
That was the
not
book.
exactly
That is the book that was being referred to now. Yeah, Gandhi's
yes, yes,
Hinduism,
yes.
the struggle
And
against Jinnah's Islam.
Islam. So I would just like to go a step further and if we can differentiate between Jinnah's Islam and Maududi's Islam.
Yeah, well,
which like
Maududi
which is
Islam was Jamaat-e-Islami, which had an earlier doctrinaire element to it. Jinnah's Islam was a political creation which borrowed from Jamaat-e-Islami, and Jinnah was actually conceited enough to believe that he could, finesse even Jamaat-e-Islami after he had used Jamaat-e-Islam. For instance, it is now widely known that Jinnah, after having got Pakistan, tried to say that no, it would not be an Islamic nation. I mean, the Jamaat-e-Islami, Maududi, and everybody else stood up and said, I think asked, well, if you didn't create it for Islam, what did you create it for? Jinnah himself had no idea of the geography or the philosophy or the doctrines that would pervade in the country he had created. I'll give you an example which sticks because it's a common sense example. He kept his house in Bombay because he thought that he would come over and stay here. He sold his house in Delhi, but he kept his house in Bombay. Now, India, by the way, politically has had kingdoms and so on and so forth, as many as in Europe, all through history. But there has never been a time in India when anyone needed a visa to go from one place to the other. They probably thought that, you could create a new nation and not need a visa. They didn't understand truly what the new nation concept was going to be. And I think there are no excuses for this ignorance, but except that the price that has been paid, that continues to be paid, is extraordinary. It's tragic.
And so, with this context in mind, the backdrop that Pakistan having gone through this intense radicalization, Jamaat-e-Islami, Maududi thought, and even the Salafi, Wahhabi radicalization having a sweeping sway over Pakistan. What kind of future do you visualize for Pakistan? I mean, I have read your tinderbox past and present for Pakistan, in which you have discussed about Pakistan being a jelly state, but with Taliban back in power, what would be the likely impacts of that, I would say, the religious regime in Afghanistan and its impact on Pakistan? Do you feel that, I mean, that may go switch out of Pakistan Army's control, and it will have a very hazardous impact on the radicalization scenario in Pakistan as well as the rest of the South Asia?
Well, I know the rest of South Asia has emerged out of different experiences. It will have some impact everywhere. But I think the people understand what they need. And that, for me, is more important than what governments think about situations. But I would also like to use this opportunity to answer a question put before it's on my screen by Ararat Kostanian. And the question, the New World Order is clear as the new coming superpowers have their own political and social systems, but national economies or economic system different from capitalism hasn't emerged. How do you see upcoming world in this context? I think it's a very, very good question. And if there is no emergence of a new economic order, then in fact, the structures that are being built will not hold. This is an extremely important point. I only hinted at it when I said that the New World Order has to make, for example, the elimination of poverty its most important objective, not the creation of wealth. That is pure capitalism. Pure capitalism depends on the creation of wealth and its dispersal or dispersal. But the true objective of the New World Order has to be the complete elimination of poverty, the creation of a new standard of living, which is the new normal, and a new standard of living in which we see the elimination of this curse, which has been the part of history ever since. Of course, the greatest ideas, and I truly think that Marxism was an enormously great idea in its theory and its purpose and its objectives. It was, in a sense, deflected and defeated by those who practiced it rather than by the enemy. But the purpose which turned it into such a force in international affairs, and which at one time had more than half the world under its influence, was because it wanted to create a new economic order. And no new world order will exist without the changing the priorities. How can you possibly have the wealth of America in 700 families? 700 families, can you believe it? And when the American president tries to actually put some kind of a tax on them, it is defeated. I mean, 0.001% of people in the world control 90% of world's wealth. And once upon a time, you had multinationals. Once upon a time, you had nations which control the wealth of nations. Today, we have now crossed the boundaries of wealth of nations, and it has become the wealth of corporations, particularly after the technology revolution. The next 10, 15 years, if we search for a new order, we will have to find means by which we can bring this new wealth grabbers, the new wealth accumulators under some kind of a participative role in the world economies rather than an acquisitive role.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. So my next question pertains to Kashmir, sir. Before the abrogation of Article 370, we saw that Kashmir was going through strong undercurrents of pan-Islamism, especially which became manifest in the form of Pulwama suicide bombing, in which a local boy from Kashmir participated in the suicide bombing, which was a phenomenon very rare in Kashmir. Before that, participation of local Kashmiris in suicide bombing was not something very common. And after that, I mean, yes. So we abrogated Article 370. After that, Western media criticized India for security and communication lockdown and all kinds of so-called alleged repression. So now, given that scenario, where do you see Kashmir heading towards? I mean, do you feel that the youth, youngsters especially, they would be more tilting towards the global pan-Islamist tendencies, or you see some kind of the internationalization of Kashmir issue, or you visualize them integrating more with the Indian mainstream?
You know, sometimes I feel that the latest news from the ground is probably the best answer to complicated questions like yours. In the last few days, Kashmir has seen a tripling of tourism. Tourism is the best evidence you can find that geography is at peace with itself. Right? There are now, laser shows going on in Dal Lake. The tulips that have risen, flowers that emerge springtime are gathering, or visitors. Right? It is not that the problems of Kashmir are over. No, but yes, with good management, with effective management, governance, and with governance that promises development, yes, you can bring a situation and create, to repeat the phrase, the new normal. One of the other guests here, something popped up, and he suggested, respectfully, he said that the epoch of nation states is over. Perhaps. I'm merely offering my views, and I am as respectful to your views, sir, as you are to mine. But in my view, the architecture of the world for the foreseeable future, I can't see more than what is foreseeable. The architecture is going to be controlled by nation states, and these nation states are going to, of course, cooperate, just as the European Union, just as the old, perhaps Warsaw Pact nations, just as the ASEAN nations, just as the BIMSTEC nations, right? They are going to be nation states which believe in cooperation, in finding economic solutions forward, and in taking a process of a shared prosperity forward to the extent possible. I know words are easy and action is more difficult, but yet I think we cannot be defeated just because the rational, the positive very often is deflected by perhaps our own weaknesses.
Thank you. So we have one question from Mr. Gautam Chintamani. It says, as
Yes.
opposed to India's decision to stress on localization of defense manufacturing, could Germany's decision to increase its defense budget act as a lease of life for the military-industrial complex as it exists? Initial reports indicate that Germany would be buying aircrafts from the United States.
Well, it will increase the power, the economic power, but it will decrease the political power. Because Germany is not buying those planes from whichever Lockheed or wherever, I don't know which companies, right? Germany is not buying those planes in order to serve Americans' interests. They are buying it to serve Germany's interests. And Germany's interests will be definitely askance of America. There will be no carbon copies. That is what the lesson of the past 15, 20 years is, that nations which outsource their security to a superpower eventually hurt themselves far more than the superpower, far more, sort of lose far more than the marginal benefits they may have gained. Security is going to be a very strong element of the nation state. Yes, of course, I do believe that the dominance of the defense companies in certain countries will eventually also be challenged. And it will be challenged even by countries like ours. India will see defense manufacturing independence and within 10, 15 years.
Please mute yourself. I can hear some noises. Please mute. Yes, sir. So one more question. Yeah, that's again related to the current situation of this Ukraine-Russia war. So what kind of effects do you see it may have on the Chinese geostrategic behavior in the Indo-Pacific? A lot of people talk about China.
Very, very, very important question. And I referred to it in the beginning. Let me just repeat. If Washington does not watch out, then the sunset of Kabul, which I believe for America has become, has moved into the twilight of Ukraine. Ukraine is a very important signal to the world that America's abilities are by its own admission constrained, right? Will deepen into the darkness if America does not take a position, does not face assertively the challenge that it has emerged, will emerge, has emerged in the Pacific. And by that, I think very clearly we know who we are talking about. Right? I think the Americans also know what we are talking about. And if the Beijing does not recognize that what it did in Tibet cannot be repeated, then I think that will be a failure, very, very, very significant and dangerous failure on Beijing's part.
Thank you. So now one question I have from your book, the latest one, Dulali Sahab and the Black Zamindar. So we I felt that you discussed a lot about this alliance between the Britishers and the privileged elites of India and their massive corruption, especially in the early days of British period in Bengal, and also about the famines and the exploitation. But we don't come across much scholarship and in-depth writings on this. I mean, definitely, Amartya Sen did talk about the famines and how the British were complicit, and yes. But I mean, I have done my graduation, masters from Delhi University previously, but in terms of a systematic scholarly study, we never came across these issues. Okay, I mean, why there's this such a big dearth of good writings on this?
You are absolutely 100. It's a question I have asked myself 1,000,000 times. These facts, where have the facts about famine? And when these facts are there, please hear and shudder in horror. Warren Hastings writes in 1772 to the Court of Directors of the East India Company that between 1/3 and half of Bengal has died in famine. Think about it, died of hunger, starvation. It is nothing short of genocide. Half, right? 1/3 to half has died. And yet he has increased revenues by using violence. He isn't writing that I'm sorry, I've had to use a bit of my revenues for famine relief. It is not till the end of the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, finally in Madras, 1880s, that some form of relief started to be given. And then, of course, during Curzon's time. But even after that, British Raj began in famine, British Raj ended in famine, which is 1943 in Bengal. My question is not to the British. They didn't come here to help Indians. They came here to exploit and did it very successfully. The question is, why have Indian historians, last 70 years, why have you not turned this into part of every Indian child's, young person's consciousness? And that, I feel, is a great, great failure. I see Ravi Mishra's hand has been raised.
Mr. Ravi, please write your question in the chat box if you can, or if you would like to read it out.
Yes, I see on the chat box mention that the Bengal famine was under Churchill. Yes, indeed it was. But Churchill's crimes are at least comparatively well known. What about the crimes before that? For 150 years. Sir, it is from 1760 onwards that the one thing that could be predicted about British Raj was that famine would recur. I mean, it is not simply a failure of drought. It is the exploitation of famine to enrich the colonial administrators, to enrich the empire. You talk about the debt, which officially, forget what was stolen, that officially the British owed to India by the time they left in 47, which they never paid. War debts, every single thing. I'm sure you know that in 1882, when the British went to quote unquote conquer Egypt, they took 8 million pounds from India to finance the whole military operation. Do you think this money was repaid? No chance, sir, no chance. That is the real meaning of colonization.
Sir, can I go ahead with my question?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Sir, you referred to the rise of China, and of course the equations between the United States and China, especially in the Indo-Pacific, but also worldwide. One thought that comes to my mind is that the Chinese geography in its neighborhood is fundamentally different from the geography that the United States faces. And as we know that geography does play a very important role in the emergence of all great powers. So from that point of view, do you think that given the current situation, in the foreseeable future, China will be able to shake off the disadvantages that its distinctive geography imposes on it and emerge as the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific?
No, what are the drawbacks of its geography? It's got Pacific to one side.
Well,
It's
it
got
is
Himalaya
surrounded. It is surrounded by
open.
It is surrounded by many powerful countries, unlike the United States.
Oh no. I mean, I don't know about anyone being surrounded by powerful countries, because power is a floating dynamic through history. And power and size have very little to do with each other. So the moment one nation becomes powerful, it's a comparative reality. Then previous powers automatically. Through the 19th century, when the Russian Empire was expanding at a phenomenal pace every day towards the east, China was disintegrating. 19th century, India was disintegrating. Then India, China, Ottoman Empire, in Asia, these the Russian Empire, these had been the four major empires of this region, and you can see that the seesaw was in operation as the western part of Asia, the Russians, and then the British came in and became a dominant force. The China and India, in a sense, you are only as powerful as your victim is weak. And that lesson is definitely going to. So China's rise is not going to be because of its neighborhood or lack of. China's rise or fall eventually will be controlled by whether it meets the requirements of what a 21st nation state must be. Whether it gives democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of faith, and so on and so forth to its people. Because all such powers eventually have to be answerable to their own people.
Thank you very much, sir.
So now I have two related questions since you were in the foreign ministry, and so it's about that. I mean, we see that India's role and responsibilities in the global diplomacy are on the rise, but still our cadre strength of diplomats is very small. Even a small country like Singapore has much larger number of diplomats than we have. So, I mean, how do you look at it? How can we increase and the quantity and quality both? And also, what's your take on the lateral entry system in the foreign policy, in the foreign ministry? And this is the first question. And secondly, I would also like to know your thoughts on the emerging international relations think tanks in India.
The power of democracy is not determined by how many people parrot it. It's by what you stand for and what you say. So in another context, I was saying that, India's diplomats are not wolf warriors, because, they have not been asked or told to behave in kind of wolf packs and an aggression, right? They are diplomats who believe in the power of balance. They take a balanced approach. This is why today, despite our alleged shortage in numbers, today we must be the one significant country which has friends across the regional or geographical binaries. We are friends with Iran, we are friends with Saudi, right? We are today, our relationship with Moscow, our relationship with Washington is coming into play. And it is this ability to actually, in a sense, rise above the regional conflicts, because we do not believe in aggression as a means to resolution. It doesn't, as I said before, mean that we do not know the meaning of defense. Of course, we know the meaning of defense. Not a single inch of Indian territory will ever be compromised, right? And every single Indian who becomes a victim of terrorism, there shall be accountability. Prime Minister Modi has laid this down very clearly, very effectively, and proved it. So I think, of course, all of us would like more of everything, but I don't think that is going to be a critical problem, the number of diplomats. It's what the diplomats say and what they stand for, which is going to be far more important. And as for think tanks, well, we have a growing number of tanks. What we should have is a growing number of thoughts.
Thank you. So my last question is about the internal scenario in India. I mean, this is my last question, but definitely our house is open for the audience, for the participants, so we can take two more questions after this. So my question is about the internal political scenario, political as well as the cultural, social scenario. I mean, we see that opposition is getting smaller and smaller day by day. So politically, I mean, what situation do you visualize? I mean, will it be first question? Will it be
Look,
on?
let me answer that. Let me answer that very clearly. You know,
Yeah.
the greatest fact of democracy is that nothing is predictable, right? So once again, we should not believe that things cannot sort of democracy is about the assertion of viewpoints, and viewpoints always are volatile. I see a question by Brigadier Sanjay Agarwal. You can mention that.
Yeah. In the ongoing Ukraine war, the forcing down the throat of the warped American narrative globally reminds me of the Ovalian state. What are the preventive measures to mitigate these dangers of an Ovalian state?
Well, media is one of the milder facts of the quote unquote Orwellian state. I mean, in wartime, as Brigadier, you would know all too well, one of the most important instinctive urges of any government is to keep control of the narrative. And by keeping control of the narrative, basically it is meant to shade and shape the narrative by excluding what you don't want others to know and including what you think is your preferred set of facts. So everyone plays that game.
Thank you. So I'll just come back to my related question to that. I mean, you answered about the situation of the opposition and the future of democracy. But another related question, like in many scholarly quarters and even the media related quarter, it is being felt that in India, either there's this, the Muslims are feeling very alienated, and also there's a situation, or there's a situation of rising radicalization among the Muslim community. So the big, and their reaction to some of the state measures like the CAA, NRC Act, or even the recent hijab row, etc. It all no, it doesn't portend well for the communal harmony in India, and there's a feeling that things are not very cordial at the grassroots. So, what's your take on this?
Any feeling of alienation must be corrected, whether it is based on facts or whether it is based on a perception. If it is happening, then it is very important that alienation has to be corrected. This is imperative, and I think it is as much it's a kind of shared responsibility between both the communities involved and the governments to eliminate those elements of rhetoric which create alienation. Actually, if you come down to the real facts of governance, I mean, let's take a very simple thing like the dispersal of free food during the pandemic. I'm only taking an example. I mean, there was no discrimination shown in it with any community. All communities got the food. Whoever was poor got the food. Now, that is good governance. However, simultaneously, there are certain people who make certain remarks which create great alienation. Now, wherever anything, word, gesture, which disturbs harmony, must be corrected and must be eliminated.
And so, how can this be done? I mean, you suggest a counter narrative.
It can be done by correction. Correction is done. If something has come out of your mouth, you have to correct it. That's not difficult.
Thank you.
I saw one more question.
Yes, yeah. One last question from Mohammed Anas. Will we see easing of tensions between India and Pakistan in the near future?
Well, I think before we can see easing of tensions between India and Pakistan, we will wait. We will have to wait to see an easing of tension between Pakistan and Pakistan.
Yeah.
The real problem they seem to have is their internal conflicts. They have become an extremely unstable polity, which reflects the kind of unease and on the ground. And maybe history is asking Pakistan questions to which no one has adequate answers.
Thank you.
I think that was the last question.
Yes. Okay. Just adding to that, Mr. Imran Khan has become a very good admirer of India's foreign policy lately. We're quite pleased and surprised both to hear his remarks. So just we can take one more questions from the audience. Please feel free. And if there's no question, then I can just end our today's session. No
I think we
question.
have had a very fertile lot of questions,
Yes.
so perhaps
Yes,
you
sir.
can end.
Thank you. Definitely. So thank you very much, sir, for joining us today. And we are absolutely enlightened by your thoughts on a diverse range of topics. And we really try to bother you, trouble you with questions, ranging from domestic politics to the political Islam to the new world order. I mean, we didn't want to trouble you, but we had so many queries that, we just couldn't resist ourselves. So definitely we look forward to engaging you more often at Usanas Foundation, and it has been a real honor to host you here today. Thank you very much, sir. And I also convey my warmest regards and thanks to all the participants who joined us today to watch this exciting interview and this interesting discussion. Okay. Thank you very much and hope to see you again.
Thank you all very much, and thank you very much, Abhinav, and thank you all very much for being here. It has been really a pleasure. And yes, I do hope to keep in touch. My email is with Usanas, and I'm very privileged to be at this think tank. Thank you all very much. Do please get in touch if you feel like.
Definitely. Namaskar.
Thank you. Namaskar.